Welcome back to Strange Epochs. I'm Sean Spainhour, and this is the show where we take one strange, true, documented moment from somewhere in the long and bewildering span of human history, and we sit with it. New episodes every Tuesday. Sources are always in the episode description. This week we are going to New York City. The year is 1835. The city is loud, crowded, changing fast, and absolutely full of newspapers that are competing for readers in a way that is new and aggressive and slightly unhinged. The penny press has arrived, cheap daily papers aimed at ordinary working people rather than the educated merchant class that had previously defined the newspaper audience. And the competition for circulation is fierce and getting fiercer. In this environment, a newspaper called The Sun is about to publish a story. The story will claim that the famous British astronomer Sir John Herschel, using a powerful new telescope at the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, has discovered life on the moon. Not microbial life, not abstract signs of habitability. Life, lush forests, rushing rivers, amethyst crystals the size of buildings, herds of blue unicorns, bipedal beavers who carry their young under their arms, and, most famously, a race of winged humanoids given the scientific name Vespertilio Homo, or Batmen, who live in communities, build temples, and appear to practice a form of agriculture. The story will run across 6 articles over the following 2 weeks. It will be presented as a reprint from an authoritative scientific journal. It will cite a real astronomer. It will deploy the specific vocabulary of 19th century science with enough precision to sound credible to readers who are not scientists. The New York Times will call the discoveries probable and possible. Religious groups will begin planning missionary expeditions to the moon. The Sun's circulation will shoot from 8,000 to nearly 20,000 copies per day, making it briefly the most widely read newspaper in the world. It is completely, entirely, deliberately fabricated. Every word of it. The Great Moon Hoax of 1835. A story about a newspaper, a reporter, a world that was hungry for wonder, and the specific question that this hoax raises, and has never entirely stopped raising. When we want something to be true badly enough, how hard do we look to see if it isn't? Let's begin. New York City, August 25th, 1835, a Tuesday morning. The newsboys are out early. The newsboys are one of the distinctive features of penny press New York young men and boys who buy papers from the publisher at a discount and sell them on street corners for a penny, keeping the difference, their income, dependent entirely on how many papers they can move on a given day. The better the story, the more papers they sell. The better the story, the louder they shout. On this particular Tuesday morning, the boys selling The Sun are shouting something that is stopping people in the street. Great astronomical discoveries. Remarkable lunar observations. Life on the moon. New York in 1835 is a city in the process of becoming something unprecedented. The population is around 270,000. It will double within 20 years. The Erie Canal has been open for a decade, making New York the commercial hub of the continent. The docks are crowded with ships from everywhere. The streets are full of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, England, and a dozen other countries, all arriving into a city that is building itself faster than it can accommodate them. It is loud, ambitious, unfinished, and hungry for everything, for trade, for novelty, for advancement, for the sense that the world is moving forward and New York is at the front of it. Into this city, a newspaper drops a story about life on the moon, and the city stops on street corners to read it. New Yorkers buy the paper. They read the first installment of a series of articles presented as reprinted from the Edinburgh Journal of Science, describing observations made at the Cape of Good Hope by Sir John Herschel, one of the most prominent astronomers in the world. The articles describe a new telescope of extraordinary power, capable of magnifying objects on the lunar surface to a degree previously impossible. And through this telescope, the articles say, Herschel's companion, a doctor, Andrew Grant, whose name lends the account a specific air of scholarly authority, has observed things that no human being has ever seen. The moon, it turns out, is alive. There are forests of red and brown trees, unlike anything on Earth. There are inland seas of deep blue water with beaches of white sand. There are herds of animals moving across the open plains, a creature like a bison with a single horn on its forehead, a goat-like animal of extraordinary beauty, a herd of what appear to be miniature zebras. The landscape is vivid and detailed and described with the precision of a man who has spent careful hours at a powerful eyepiece. And then, in later installments, the inhabitants, bipedal beavers, walking upright, carrying their young under their arms, building small fires outside what appear to be shelters of their own construction. And the Batmen, the Vespertilio Homo, a race of winged humanoid creatures approximately 4 feet tall, with yellowish skin, covered in fine copper-colored hair, with wings like a bat's folded against their backs when they walk and spread when they fly. They appear, the articles say, to live in communities. They appear to speak to each other. One group was observed near a grand structure that could only be described as a temple. New York is transfixed. Across town, in a magazine office on Broadway, a writer named Edgar Allan Poe reads the first article and feels something shift inside him. Not wonder, not credulity, a specific, cold irritation, because Poe had written almost exactly this story a few months earlier as obvious fiction, and the Sun is publishing it as fact, and people are believing it. To understand the Great Moon Hoax, you have to understand what American newspapers were in 1835 and what they were becoming, because the hoax did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the specific context of a media revolution that was transforming how Americans received information, who received it, and what kind of information commanded attention. Before the penny press, American newspapers were expensive. A year's subscription to a respectable New York paper cost around $10, a significant sum for a working person in the 1820s, equivalent to several days' wages for many laborers. The papers were aimed at the merchant and professional class, full of commercial notices and political commentary and foreign dispatches that reflected the interests of that audience. They were not designed for the factory worker or the dock hand or the domestic servant. They were not designed to be interesting in the way that popular entertainments were interesting. They were designed to be useful to people who needed specific kinds of commercial and political information to do their jobs. The penny press changed all of this. Beginning in the early 1830s, a new kind of newspaper appeared in New York, sold for a penny rather than 6 cents, available on the street rather than only by subscription, written in a livelier and more accessible style, aimed at the broadest possible readership rather than a specific educated class. The Sun, founded in 1833, was one of the pioneers of this format. Benjamin Day, its founder, had hit on the formula almost accidentally. Put interesting stories on the front page, keep the language accessible, keep the price low, and let the newsboys do the distribution. The paper was profitable almost immediately. The Sun was founded by Benjamin Day in 1833, with a specific and somewhat cynical insight. If you could get enough people to read your paper, you could charge advertisers enough to make the paper profitable, even at a penny per copy. The model was not primarily about selling papers to readers. It was about selling readers to advertisers. This insight that the audience is the product rather than the customer is one of the foundational ideas of modern media, and Benjamin Day arrived at it almost a century before it became the explicit basis of the advertising-supported media economy we now live in. The Sun was, by 1835, profitable and growing, and increasingly aware that the key to continued growth was keeping readers interested enough to come back every day. The penny press introduced something to American journalism that had not existed in its previous form: the concept of the story as the primary unit of value, not the dispatch, not the commercial notice, not the political essay, the story, the narrative account of something interesting, written to hold a reader's attention from first paragraph to last, designed to provoke curiosity and then satisfy it in ways that left the reader wanting the next installment. The penny press invented, in a real sense, the modern news story, and in doing so, it created the specific vulnerability that the Great Moon Hoax exploited. The reader who had been trained to find stories compelling and had not been trained to distinguish true compelling stories from false ones. The Sun, in 1835, was in competition with at least a dozen other New York papers, several of which were also penny papers, using similar formulas. The competition for readers was intense. Circulation determined advertising revenue. Advertising revenue determined survival. A paper that broke a major story that had something on a given day that every other paper lacked could sell thousands of extra copies in a single morning. The incentive structure was designed to reward audacity. Into this environment stepped Richard Adams Locke. Locke was an unusual figure in the penny press world. He was Cambridge educated, the descendant of John Locke, the philosopher, familiar with the scientific and philosophical literature of his day in a way that most newspaper writers of the period were not. He had come to New York via a circuitous route through journalism in England and had arrived at the Sun with skills that went considerably beyond the typical reporter. He could write the language of science convincingly. He understood what made scientific reporting sound authoritative, what specific vocabulary and rhetorical moves distinguished a genuine scientific account from a layman's summary of one. He had, in short, exactly the skills needed to construct the specific kind of hoax he was about to construct. Whether this was luck or calculation, the result was the same. Locke was an English journalist who had immigrated to New York and found work at the Sunday. He was educated, widely read, familiar with the scientific literature of his day, and possessed of a facility with the specific register of academic prose that would prove essential to the hoax's success. He later claimed, in a letter he wrote in 1840, 5 years after the fact, the first time he publicly admitted authorship, that the Moon articles had been intended as a satire of what specifically has been debated since. He may have been satirizing the popular science writing of his day, which had a tendency toward breathless speculation about the plurality of worlds and the probability of life on other planets. He may have been satirizing the credulity of his readers. He may have been satirizing the penny press itself, which had demonstrated a willingness to print almost anything that would sell papers. Whether the articles were intended as satire or as a straightforward circulation stunt, they were executed with remarkable craft. Locke understood that the hoax would succeed only if the details were right, if the articles deployed enough genuine scientific vocabulary and enough plausible-sounding technical description to create the impression of credibility. He cited a real astronomer. Sir John Herschel was genuinely at the Cape of Good Hope in 1835, conducting a genuine astronomical survey, and was genuinely famous enough that his name carried authority. He cited a scientific journal that had recently ceased publication, which meant readers could not easily obtain a copy to check whether the reprinted articles were genuine. He invented a companion for Herschel Dr. Andrew Grant, whose non-existence could not easily be verified. He described the telescope with enough technical detail to sound plausible to readers who did not know enough astronomy to detect the impossibilities. The result was a piece of journalism that was, in its construction, almost a work of art. It was also completely false, and it sold 20,000 newspapers a day. The 6 articles ran between August 25th and September 16th, 1835. They build progressively, the way good serial fiction does, each installment revealing more of the lunar world, escalating the wonder, holding back the most remarkable discoveries for later in the series. It is the structure of a thriller rather than a scientific report, and it is this narrative sophistication that reveals most clearly how carefully Locke had constructed the hoax. The specific elements that made the articles convincing to an 1835 reader are worth examining, because they reveal something about how trust works in the context of media. The first and most important was the attribution to Herschel. John Herschel was not a fictional character deployed for local color. He was the son of William Herschel, who had discovered Uranus. He had cataloged thousands of stars and nebulae. He was one of the most eminent scientists alive. He was the kind of person whose name on a discovery would make even a skeptic pause before dismissing it. Using his name was the essential move, the one that made all the other details possible. Without Herschel, the articles would have been fantastic adventure. With him, they were scientific reporting. The first article establishes the frame. It describes the telescope Herschel has built, an instrument of extraordinary power, with a lens 24 feet in diameter, capable of magnifying lunar objects to within 90 yards of the observer. The technical description is elaborate and sounds authoritative. It also describes a revolutionary method for illuminating the magnified image using an oxyhydrogen projector that could project the image onto a large screen for multiple observers. A detail that adds a theatrical quality to the discoveries and conveniently explains how so many people could observe the same phenomena simultaneously. The first article barely mentions the moon itself. It builds the instrument. It establishes authority. It makes the reader wait. The second article begins the observations. Herschel turns the telescope to the moon and begins to describe what he sees in the language of a naturalist cataloging a newly discovered continent. Forests, unlike any on Earth. Enormous angular crystals, described as quartz rising from the lunar surface like pillars. A deep blue ocean. Beaches of white sand. Then the first animals. A creature, like a miniature bison, with a single curved horn on its forehead, observed moving in a herd across an open plain. Then, something resembling a tailless sheep with a reddish-brown fleece. The detail is extraordinary. The language is precise. The accumulation of specific observations creates an overwhelming impression of a report from a man who was actually there and saw these things. The animals proliferate in the third and fourth articles. Blue unicorns are observed in a meadow near a lunar forest. A creature resembling a goat with a single backward curving horn is spotted near a body of water. A species of amphibious creature is seen in a shallow lake and then walking upright on what appears to be dry land near a stream. Something that is clearly not simply an animal, a beaver, bipedal, carrying its young under its arms, dragging branches across the ground to what appears to be a constructed shelter, making what appears to be fire outside the entrance. The article is careful to note that the beaver-like creatures do not appear to have a tail. which distinguishes them from the earth beaver, and, the article implies with scholarly seriousness, suggests a distinct evolutionary line. The Batmen arrive in the fourth article, and it is clear that Locke has been holding them back deliberately. They are the climax. Approximately 4 feet tall, with yellowish skin, covered in fine copper-colored hair, with membranous wings like those of a bat folded against their backs. They walk upright, use their hands with apparent dexterity, and communicate with each other through sounds. They are observed in groups, moving between what appear to be structures of their own construction. They display what the article carefully describes as apparent rationality, not proven intelligence, but behavior consistent with intelligence, the kind of hedged language that lends scientific credibility while allowing the imagination full rein. The fifth article introduces a temple, a grand structure, apparently made of polished sapphire, rising from the lunar surface in a remote valley. The Batmen are observed entering and leaving it. The article speculates delicately about whether this constitutes evidence of religious belief, then pulls back, noting that the observers could not be certain about the purpose of the structure. The restraint is a masterstroke. A hoaxer who overclaimed would have broken the spell. Locke's careful hedging made the readers supply the conclusion themselves, which made it more convincing than if he had stated it outright. The sixth article explains, with theatrical regret, that the telescope was accidentally left facing the sun during the daytime, which focused the sunlight through the lens and destroyed the observatory in a fire. No further observations can be made. The story ends not with a conclusion, but with a promise deferred. When the telescope is rebuilt, observations will resume. The reader is left wanting more, which is the most effective ending any serial narrator can provide. The reception was extraordinary. The sun's circulation numbers, already healthy, jumped significantly with each installment. The paper could not print copies fast enough on some days. Readers gathered in the streets to hear the articles read aloud by those who could afford a copy. The story was reprinted in papers across the country and around the world, first in other American cities, then in England, then in translation across Europe. An Italian artist named Leopoldo Galuzzo published a series of colored lithographs depicting the lunar animals and the Batmen that circulated widely and gave the story its most vivid visual form. The New York Times, then a relatively new paper, not yet at the height of its influence, reviewed the articles and called the lunar discoveries probable and possible. The Journal of Commerce sent a delegation to the Sun's offices, asking to see the original Edinburgh Journal of Science, from which the articles were supposedly reprinted. They were told, with considerable ingenuity, that the original was still at the printers and could not be retrieved. They left unsatisfied, but unprovoked. 2 scientists from Yale traveled all the way from New Haven to New York to find the original journal, were given the same runaround at the printing office, and went home without raising a public alarm. Religious societies began making plans. A missionary society in Springfield, Massachusetts, apparently began discussing the logistics of converting the lunar Batmen to Christianity, a project whose practical challenges the society had not yet begun to work through when the hoax was revealed. The story had entered the space where people were not evaluating it as a factual claim, but treating it as a reality to be responded to. Edgar Allan Poe, watching from across town, was furious. Poe had published a story earlier that year called The Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall, which described a man who traveled to the moon in a homemade balloon and discovered life there. The story was obvious fiction, marked as such by its fanciful premise and its comedic elements. Locke's articles, Poe felt, had stolen his basic concept, dressed it in scientific language, and sold it as fact to an audience that was apparently too credulous to notice. He wrote about the hoax with a mixture of professional outrage and genuine intellectual contempt for the readers who had been taken in. He was, Poe, simultaneously dismissive of the hoax and humiliated that people had believed Locke when they had only smiled at his own moon fiction. Poe's response to the moon hoax is one of the more interesting footnotes in American literary history because it reveals something about the relationship between fiction and journalism in this period that goes beyond simple professional rivalry. Poe had written Hans Fall as an obvious parody of scientific adventure narratives, the kind of story that is clearly fantastic, that makes no serious effort to deceive, that is playing with the conventions of the genre for comic effect. Locke had taken the same basic premise and removed the comedy, replaced the obvious impossibilities with plausible-sounding technical details, and sold it to 20,000 people as scientific fact. What irritated Poe was not that Locke had stolen his idea. What irritated him was that Locke had done something Poe would not do. He had lied to his readers, and they had rewarded him for it. The moon hoax raised, for Poe, a question about the relationship between the imagination and the truth that he would spend the rest of his career working around. The hoax began to unravel in mid-September of 1835, when a journal called the Journal of Commerce published an analysis questioning the article's authenticity. The Sun did not initially deny the story. Instead, it published a response that neither confirmed nor denied the hoax, but suggested that the discoveries were genuinely extraordinary, and that skeptics should consider whether their disbelief said more about their own limited imagination than about the quality of the evidence. This is a tactic that will also be familiar to anyone who has followed modern debates about misinformation. The deflection from the factual question to the character question, the suggestion that the doubter is the problem. On September 16th, 1835, the Sun finally admitted that the articles were fabricated. The admission was brief and unapologetic. The paper noted that it had published an entertaining series, that the series had been widely enjoyed, and that the public had received a great deal of pleasure from the articles and had not been materially harmed by them. It did not apologize. It did not retract. It acknowledged the fabrication in the way that a magician acknowledges a trick after the performance is over, as a demonstration of craft rather than as a confession of wrongdoing. The public response to the exposure was largely fine. This is perhaps the most interesting thing about the Great Moon hoax. It did not destroy the Sunday. It did not produce a wave of reader outrage, a collapse of trust, a boycott, or a reckoning. Circulation did not fall precipitously after the exposure. The paper continued to publish. Benjamin Day continued to profit. Richard Adams Locke continued to write. The readers who had been fooled, by and large, found the whole experience entertaining rather than humiliating. They had enjoyed the story while they believed it, and they enjoyed knowing how it was done after they stopped believing it. The relationship between the Sun and its readers was not primarily a relationship built on trust in the conventional sense. It was a relationship built on the delivery of entertainment, and the moon articles had been excellent entertainment. The fact that they were fiction did not change that. This response tells us something important about the penny press and about the audiences it was cultivating. The readers who bought The Sun in 1835 were not the educated merchant class that had previously been the newspaper audience. They were ordinary, working New Yorkers who had not been trained to think of newspapers as reliable sources of factual information, because newspapers, for most of their history, had not been reliable sources of factual information. Newspapers had always mixed reporting with editorializing, rumor with fact, entertainment with news. The penny press had simply lowered the price and raised the entertainment value. The idea that a newspaper story should be held to a strict standard of factual accuracy was not yet an established norm. The moon hoax was not a violation of a norm that everyone agreed on. It was a test of a norm that was still being negotiated. There is a specific irony in the comparison between the public response to the moon hoax and the response to genuinely true but equally remarkable stories published in American newspapers of the same period. The 1830s were an era of rapid and genuine scientific discovery. The decade saw advances in chemistry, geology, biology, and astronomy that were, if anything, more remarkable than the fictional discoveries described in The Sunday. But those genuine discoveries, reported in the technical language of the journals where they appeared, were not read by 20,000 people a day in New York. The Batmen were. The fictional moon civilization captured an audience that the genuine scientific revolution of the period could not. This is a paradox that the history of media has not resolved. The more accessible a piece of information is, the more likely it is to spread. The more it has been optimized for spreading, the less likely it is to be accurate. The Sun's unapologetic response to the exposure is, in retrospect, one of the most revealing moments of the whole episode. A newspaper that had presented fiction as fact for 3 weeks, that had caused religious societies to begin planning missions to the moon, that had misled millions of readers across 2 continents. This newspaper acknowledged its fabrication as if it had played a prank and was mildly amused by the success of it. There was no reckoning. There was no serious questioning of whether the Sun's practices were appropriate. There was no pressure from readers, from advertisers, or from competitors to change the way the paper operated. The exposure of the hoax was simply absorbed by the media environment, the way a stone dropped in a pond is absorbed rings of disturbance that spread outward and eventually flatten. The pond looks the same. The stone is at the bottom. The newsboys are back on the corner tomorrow morning, shouting about the next story. Sir John Herschel himself received a somewhat different response. He had been at the Cape of Good Hope, genuinely, conducting genuine astronomical work. When the articles appeared, he first learned of the hoax through letters and papers sent from England and America months after the articles ran. His reaction was not amused. He had not been consulted. His name had been used without his knowledge to lend authority to a fabrication. He found the whole affair tiresome rather than funny, and particularly objected to the way that the fiction had generated what he described as an enormous correspondence from members of the public who wished to discuss the Batmen with him as if they were real. He spent years deflecting inquiries about creatures he had never seen, in a world he had never claimed to describe. Locke's own account of his motivations, offered in that 1840 letter, is worth taking seriously even if it is self-serving. He described the articles as a satire aimed at the excessive speculation of popular science writers of the period, particularly those who wrote about the probability of life on other worlds, in a way that he found credulous and irresponsible. The Scottish writer Thomas Dick had published a work called The Christian Philosopher in 1823, in which he estimated, using a specific but entirely unsupported calculation, that the moon was home to over 4 billion inhabitants. Dick was widely read and widely cited. The idea that the moon was probably inhabited was, for a significant portion of the reading public in 1835, not a wild speculation, but a reasonable scientific assumption. Locke may genuinely have been satirizing this assumption. He may also have been constructing a retrospective justification for something he had done primarily because it would sell papers. Both things can be true simultaneously. The scientific culture of 1835 was, in ways easy to underestimate from the 21st century, genuinely open about the question of life on other worlds. The best telescopes available could resolve the lunar surface to a level of detail that showed mountains and valleys, but nothing smaller. There was no basis, from what could actually be observed, for concluding the moon was uninhabited. In this environment, the claim that Herschel had found life on the moon was surprising, but not, to a reader without deep scientific training, inherently impossible. The hoax succeeded partly because the question it answered, is there life on the moon, was genuinely open. Locke had the good fortune to be a liar, operating in a territory where the truth was not yet established. What the Great Moon Hoax represents, in the longer view of media history, is one of the first modern instances of what we now call viral misinformation. It spread faster than the means of correction could travel. By the time papers in other cities were printing skeptical analyses, the story had already been accepted as fact by millions of readers across 2 continents who would never see the correction. The articles were reprinted in London before the exposure. They were translated into French and Italian before the exposure. They circulated in China. They reached India. The correction, when it came, reached some of those readers and not others. And those it did not reach continued, in some cases for years, to believe that Sir John Herschel had found Batman on the moon. The speed of the hoax's propagation is worth understanding in context. In 1835, there was no telegraph. Information traveled at the speed of physical objects, ships, horses, postal riders. The moon articles reached London approximately 2 weeks after they were first published in New York. They reached Paris a week after that. They reached Calcutta months later. By the time the correction arrived in any given city, the story had been there long enough to have been read, discussed, cited, and embedded in the local discourse. The correction, when it came, was a single story arriving to compete with weeks of accumulated credibility. The truth was outnumbered by its own false head start. This asymmetry between the speed of a compelling false story and the speed of its correction is one of the fundamental dynamics of information systems, and the moon hoax illustrated it more clearly than almost any event before or since. The specific mechanism by which the hoax traveled is also instructive. Other newspapers reprinted the articles not because they had verified their authenticity, but because the articles were interesting and their readers would want to read them. The assumption was that if the Sun had printed them, they had some basis in fact. The authority of the source was taken as sufficient verification of the content, which is a principle that breaks down completely when the source is not reliable. The reprinting newspapers were not negligent, exactly. They were operating according to the norms of their time, which did not yet include anything like the verification practices that modern journalism aspires to. However imperfectly it achieves them. The deeper question that the moon hoax raises, and that it raises more sharply than almost any other event in the history of media, is why people wanted to believe it. Not why they were fooled. That part is explicable through the mechanics of the hoax itself, the plausible vocabulary, the famous astronomer's name, the absence of the original journal to check against. But why, when they read about Batman on the moon, they felt something that can only be described as relief. The sense of a world suddenly larger than it had seemed, a universe suddenly more populated, a reality suddenly more interesting than the one they woke up to on an ordinary Tuesday in August of 1835. The theological writers of the period, Thomas Dick and others, who wrote about the plurality of worlds, were motivated by the same impulse, which was not primarily scientific. It was existential. The idea that the universe might be full of life was comforting in the specific way that evidence of significance is comforting. It suggested that the universe was organized around something other than emptiness. Jules Verne cited the Great Moon Hoax as one of the inspirations for his 1865 novel, From the Earth to the Moon. H.G. Wells was aware of it. The tradition of science fiction that imagines life on other worlds traces one of its lines of descent directly through the Batman of 1835. The hoax that was intended to sell newspapers ended up seeding something in the imagination of the century that followed it, a century that would eventually produce rockets and radio telescopes and the actual photographs of the actual moon that would finally answer the question of whether anything was living there. The answer which the Apollo missions confirmed with finality, was no. There are no Batmen. There are no blue unicorns. There are no bipedal beavers building fires outside their shelters on the shores of the lunar seas. The moon is silent and airless and magnificent and entirely, completely empty of everything except rocks and dust and the specific desolate beauty of a place that has never been alive. The Batmen are gone. They were never there. But the specific desire that made people believe in them, the desire for a universe that is not empty, for a reality that contains more than what we can see with our own limited instruments, for the sense that out there in the dark, there is something alive and reaching back. That desire has not gone anywhere. It is still here, in every person who looks up at a clear night sky and feels the particular vertigo of scale and wonders whether, somewhere in all of that, something is looking back. Richard Adams Locke gave that desire a temporary object in 1835 and watched 20,000 people a day believe it. He was selling papers, but he was also doing something more accidental and more interesting. He was demonstrating the depth and the durability of a longing that no amount of correction has ever fully satisfied. And in New York, in August of 1835, people read about Batmen and believed it for 2 weeks, and then found out it was fiction and bought the paper the next day anyway. That's what Strange Epochs is. Stories that have no clean endings. Moments that history recorded but never quite explained. Events that happened, undeniably happened, and yet still somehow feel impossible. Everything you heard in this episode is real. Every name, every date, every detail drawn from documented historical sources. All of the sources for this episode are listed in the episode description below. I encourage you to look them up. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Strange Epochs wherever you listen. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And if you want to help the show grow, leaving a review goes a long way. It really does. I'll see you next week. I'm Sean Spainhour. This is Strange Epochs.